So R5 objective 2 is factoring by grouping. Okay, I'm going to give you the steps that you're going to follow, and when you use grouping, and how you use it. Okay, first off, you're going to use this method when there's 4 or more terms. If there's at most 3 terms, you can use other methods.
You talk about like x squared, x cubed, and x to the 4?
No, not necessarily that the degree is 4, but there will literally be 4 terms. So you'll see 3 signs, like a plus and subtraction, that kind of thing, addition and subtraction. So there'll be 3 signs separating those 4 terms. Okay. When this happens, what you're going to do is you're going to group the first half of the terms together. All right, and I'm going to show you how to do that. We're going to put them in parentheses, bless you, and we're going to factor them like it's its own problem. Okay. What do you think number 2 is going to say? Yeah. Number 2 is going to say the exact same thing, except we're going to group the second half together. So we're going to put a set of parentheses around the first half. We're going to put a set of parentheses around the second half, being careful with the second half. And we have one example of why you need to be careful. And then what should happen after you do that? How many do remember this? Okay, good. After you do that, what should happen is there should be a common group between the 2 sets. And in your homework last night, there were a few problems that were sort of halfway done like that, where you factored out a binomial. The same idea is going to happen with this. That was almost like a halfway step of factoring by grouping. So then what should happen is there should be a group in common between the 2 halves after you factor each half. And that's essentially what grouping is. Okay? We're going to go through 2 examples. I'm going to go through one because in your homework I think they only give you problems that have 4 terms, but I'm going to go through an example that has 6 just so you can see what it looks like. Here's the example. First example we're going to go through. Okay, so I've got 7cd minus c squared plus 14d minus 2c. Okay, and I'm gonna go through this one together with you, and then we'll go through another one you can try on your own after we set it up. So here's the thing. Okay, when I say group the first half, what I mean is literally put parentheses around the first half, and then put another set of parentheses around the second half. Now notice here that I split the parenthesis in between the plus and the 14. And the reason why we do that is because 14 by itself is still positive, so this plus sign doesn't have to go in there with it.
So if it's a negative, it has to go instead?
It does, and the next example is going to be like that. Okay? So then all you have to do is factor this first set of parentheses like it's its own problem. Okay? And usually that means finding a greatest common factor. So what is the greatest common factor between these 2 terms? C. So I'm going to factor a c out, which means I'm left with what? 7d minus c. Now before you do the second half, what you should understand is your goal is when you factor this second half, you should get another 7d minus 7. We're trying to get a common group. Okay? So what is in common between 14d and minus 2c? 2. Okay? So I'm going to factor out a 2 and I'm going to make it plus 2. So that plus is coming down. If it was minus, I guess we'd pull a minus out. Okay? And so when I divide that, I'm left with 7d minus c. Now this looks like one of the problems that you did for homework for today. Right? So from here I have a common group. Okay? And I have 7d minus c in common, so I just pull that common group out, and what am I left with? C plus 2. Okay, so the c and the plus 2, and that's how you factor by grouping. Okay?
And that's your answer, the 7d minus c?
Yep, that is correct. And I'm going to show you how to factor trinomials kind of like this when we get there on Tuesday. So for some of you who have struggled with factoring trinomials, you might like this grouping technique. Okay. Let's look at another example. I'm going to set it up for you, and then I'm going to have you do it. Are there any questions before I move on to that example, though?
why is the 7D minus C not squared?
Because I've taken it out that's in common. It's being multiplied by each of them, so like, same when I take a greatest common factor out, right? It would be like saying, well, this has a C and this has a C, so I don't pull C squared out, I pull the one C out. It's like looking at this one term, it's just one big group in common, I pull that group out of both. It's sort of like distributing, okay? So I'm taking this times C, this times 2. Again, factoring, remember, is always distribution backwards. It's when something's in common, we only take one of them out. So here's the next one. This one has 6 terms. Now notice, if I group the first 3 together, okay, that's no problem. Now, the second half, I have this minus. If I put the parenthesis in between the minus and the 5, I've changed its value, because it's now gone from -5 to +5. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to slide that negative inside and put a plus. Okay, and then group it. Okay. Yep. Whenever that middle term, whatever it is a minus, you need to slide it inside the parentheses and put a plus. Now go through and group and see if you get factor each of these and see if you have a common group. What is in common in this first group? What do they have in common?
6x.
6x. So I'm going to pull that 6x out, and I'm going to be left with 5a minus 4b plus c. Okay? So again, if I'm going to factor by grouping, what should happen is I'll get another one of these over here. What's important to understand, so this gets to what we were talking about before, right? If I need to be left with a 5a and this is negative, this is the reason why we factor out a negative. Because if I factor that negative out, whatever's left over will be positive. Noticing what's in common is they all have a y squared. And you could factor out a positive y squared, but then your group is going to have signs that are all backwards from what you want. Okay? So if you follow that, the idea that when the leading term is negative, you're going to be factoring out a negative, you should be safe. Okay? So in this case, instead of factoring out a y squared, I'm going to factor out a negative y squared, which means I'm left with positive 5a minus 4b plus c, which is what I wanted to begin with, right? Now these match. Now I have a matching group. Okay? So that comes out, and whether you put it first or second, it doesn't matter. I like to write the common group first, and then write in the second group whatever's left over, which is 6x minus y squared. Okay? How many had that? Your homework today, you're not going to see 6 terms. You're going to see 4 every time. But I want you to know that whether it's 6 or 7 or 8, okay, that grouping can be done with anything of 4 or more. Doesn't have to be an even number. But sometimes you have to be strategic. Like if there's a binomial that you're going to factor with a trinomial, again, your goal is to have a common thing in mind. And sometimes with grouping, when there's odd number of terms, you have to rearrange the terms a little bit first before you try to factor.